speaker today is Linda Shai. She's a Cornell University assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning, and her research focuses on how cities can adapt to climate change in ways that improve environmental sustainability and social justice. So, Linda.
So much for having me. It's Suzanne and Chris. It's really lovely to be here with you. Stuart, you have such a nice dog. I wish I had one.
I'm trying to mute my dog, but I'm not. Don't worry.
Does it work any better than muting your children? I don't know. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you and to share some of the work that Dave Reed Miller and Julia Peterson and others of us have been doing. So great to see everyone. I will share some slides and I'm happy to have people post questions in the chat as we go. And if possible, if I can multitask enough, I'll try to keep track of the chat. I'll stop partway through so that people can ask additional questions. And if we get, or we can just draw from the chat as we kick off into Q&A. So what I've proposed to talk about today is planning for climate migration and this question of whether is it something new? Because it seems to be from all the media and hype and a lot of conversation, a lot of anecdotal stories that people are seeing this impact on the ground. And to what extent is it really new wine, or is it new jar with old wine in it? And how do we think about some of these conversations and these issues? And I'll just share that these are my two kids a few years ago on the shores of Lake Ontario. All right. So the work is very related to NOAA in the family of NOAA's climate adaptation partnerships. As you guys, many of you may know, they fund these kinds of partnerships all over the country. These are some of the geographies where they're located. And they realized that they did not have coverage over all of the country, and Congress has mandated that they do try to cover all of the country. And through a planning act or a planning grant, we receive funding for a year to study the question of what does climate migration mean for the upper Northeast, where such a cap might be located? And is this region prepared? What would it mean for it to be prepared? What should we be thinking about, and how can we gear ourselves to respond to it? So I'm coming here because I'm personally like a climate adaptation governance person, and I did not necessarily start with migration or relocation, but increasingly recognize that this is a critical issue that is from small scales. Like I think there are various different scales that we're talking about, right? On the one hand, we have kind of a buyout scale, a local relocation issue. And then on the other hand, you hear a lot of conversation about global migration and people who are moving from sub-Saharan Africa into Europe or from Syria into Germany, and these kinds of conversations. So various different scales. And I became interested in this question, like many others, as we were studying the Northeast, that it's being perceived as this refuge for the rest of the country, if not the world, because it's got comparatively milder climates, but you're not yet going into Canada. You're still close to some urban centers. It has a lot of fresh water and a lot of land available for development and expansion. So maybe this would be the place where everybody wants to go to. And so we were interested in thinking about not only how can you deal with like the kind of climate impacts that would be of concern to these states as they themselves grapple with things, but also the potential influx of people coming in. And so we had this 1 year to explore these issues with lots of fantastic people that you'll see listed here, including Dave and Julia and probably many other people that you know from the region. And so we collaborated on thinking through what this would mean. And in reality, what it meant was we had a whole literature review to study what people are saying about migration. We did a lot of historical analyses to think about what has migration and population change meant in this region over the last 100, 150, 200 some years or longer. And then we did a bunch of listening tours. And maybe some of you were there in the ones that were in Maine. We had one in Buffalo, one in Ithaca, one in, I think, was it in Keene or somewhere along the Connecticut River between Vermont and New Hampshire, and then one in Portland as well last year, to hear what people had to say about the issue of climate migration. So in today's presentation, I want to first go over some kind of general terms and concepts, and then into some concepts of like the research that has been going on of what we actually know about movements of people following disasters, before shifting then into what it means for this region and how we could think about it. So what is climate migration? And who are climate refugees? And is climate refugee even a thing? What do we mean by that, right? And so I think it's really important, first of all, to understand that climate migration is not usually, people don't usually move just for climate change. Maybe there are some radical folks, right? Like that, why I see it and climate is my thing and I'm going to move for that. But most people are moving for a whole bunch of different reasons, all bundled into one. And you can think about that for yourself, your own personal moves and decisions that you've made. Most importantly, it's usually because of the job that you're going to have, or where you go to school, where you're going to be able to have a job. It's also very often because of family. I want to be closer to my children or to my parents or to my siblings or to friends. And so there are these kinds of kinship and social and economic reasons. Often tied into that is a sense of the affordability and the access of housing. I mean, I would love to live in the Bay Area, but I will never be able to afford to live there, so I can't really have that dream, particularly, right? So as part of that, the environment is, of course, a piece of it, but it rarely is the only single causal factor. Even where people are being displaced because of a major event like Hurricane Katrina or something else, where they choose to go to is not just because the climate is better somewhere else. It is also because of where the jobs and the housing and the friendship networks are. So if we think of like, people did move to the Southwest because it is seen as a place that's sunny and it doesn't have the crappy weather that the Northeast has, and it doesn't, it's warm, but it's not humid like Texas might be. Even then, there was a lot of economic expansion that complemented people's aspirations for moving there. If you think about the significant economic and population growth that Florida has had, it's not only because retirees want sunny weather, it's also tied in a lot to the tax structure that Florida has that incentivizes people on fixed income to be able to move to such a place. So as we think about then who might be coming to a place like Maine, it's not going to be only because that Maine has an availability of fresh water and an absence of drought, wildfire, and significant flooding outside of the coast, right? It's got to be other reasons as well. And then who is the moving, I think, is the other very important question. And if we think about like on the news, when we think about climate refugees, it's very often people from other countries. And this perception that there are these asylum seekers and refugees of particular ethnographic, racial, economic, and citizenship conditions that people are thinking of. And so that does constitute a very important type of mover. These are very long distance moves. And so there's all sorts of social, language, cultural dislocation that comes with that. And so like asylum seekers and refugees have provided a significant number of demographic migration into the Northeast. And many of the states have welcomed this kind of migration because of the current exodus, the long-time exodus of people from the region outside of it. So they're eager to attract folks to come live here, and that is an important group. Then there are amenity movers and second homeowners, people who want to have a vacation house someplace, and that since the days of like before the creation of the Acadia National Park as the first national park, that kind of move has been with us for a long time. These are very different people than the first group. These are often older. They are typically wealthier to be able to afford a second home. They are not necessarily going to be adding employment in the sense of, refugee movers, people who are making a new home, who are creating new businesses. These may add retail jobs or support local economy through tax bases, but they're not necessarily like creating employment. And then there's like the people that perhaps the state and the government wishes would move here, which would be like employment creators. People are going to create jobs, add economic development, employ other people, or themselves be able to contribute productively to the economy. And I think this has been perhaps the trickiest piece of how do we get this portion of migration into these regions. And we are seeing some of that, but it is also extremely difficult. So I want to just make a note of, as we think about climate migration, that the word, both the, and then climate refugee, that these words are themselves, each of them, really tricky to think about. So climate as the cause of migration is not necessarily entirely true. As I said, people are moving for many different reasons, not just climate. And then on the refugee side, as you'll see from this note from the UN Secretary, now the Secretary General, former Commissioner for Refugees, that climate change is accelerating displacement. Most people will be internally displaced. Okay, that it's like if you get flooded out of your house, your first thought isn't I'm moving to Canada or Mexico. Your first thought would be I might move to my neighbor's house next town over, right? So most of that displacement is for every country usually internally accounted for. But if they cross the border, they are not considered refugees because the refugee status, there is a convention on refugees, and that status is afforded to people who are persecuted for various reasons, their political characteristics, their sexuality, their social or other situations that would not allow them to return home and be safe. So they are given particular protections by global convention. However, for people who are displaced by disaster, that is not the case. There is currently no global refugee protections codified for people moving because of climate change or other statuses. That's beginning to be challenged a little bit in the Pacific, especially as people who are in the Pacific Islands say, like, we're about to lose our home. There is such flooding that we cannot we have no home to return to. We need to be designated and considered as refugees. And so there are law cases going on and questions of how to shift, for instance, seasonal working permits to being longer term migration passes. But at the moment, there is not such a term. So be cautious of how you use the word of refugee. If it's being used kind of colloquially, like, oh yeah, so-and-so is a climate refugee from Florida, you know, but it does not carry the same legal kind of a term. Okay, so what is the state of some of the research on climate migration? I imagine if you're here, you've been hearing quite a lot in the news about climate migration. It's in news media. There are a number of books that are now being published in the popular trade press about great migration, great displacement, nomads, you know, these kinds of issues. And if anything, I think we focus a lot on water and flooding and sea level rise as a source of flooding. And permanent displacement, but in many places, the issues of heat are actually going to be much harder to grapple with. So when we consider the massive drought and long period of drought that's happening in the Middle East and sub-Saharan Africa, that begins to force people to leave the land because they can no longer work the land and have a livelihood. And that's shaping, you know, it's not like you can just air condition your way out of that, right? And so the question of when you have long-term super high temperature changes, it's going to be not something that you can just change by building a seawall or a levee, or even by adding air conditioning, right? Because it's going to start changing your ability to build things and when construction can happen, when recreation can happen, when people can actually be outside safely. And so that can cause even more migration. So you can see the overheating of the earth, and Lustgarten's book on that. So what does that actually look like? And I just put this in perspective to say that the world has been in migration for a very long time. This is from the immigration of Europeans towards other parts of the world during the colonial period. And you can see from different countries, the different eras and where it is that they all went. And as they went, creating indentured labor, enslaved peoples. They also were transporting many people all over the world. And so on some of these maps, which I show in my intro to planning class, you can just get a sense of the magnitude of population. Like 32 million people moved from Europe to the Americas between 1600 and 1900, right? That is a massive amount of movement. And so it's not to say that we can't handle climate migration or that we have to stop people from moving, because the world has always been on the move, and it has always brought with it a lot of dislocation, environmental impacts, social conflict, but also new opportunities for creation, innovation, cultural, new kinds of cultures being created as well. And that's not just from Europe. Like 22 million people went from China to Southeast Asia in to not even 100 years in that same amount of time. In the US, we talk about the Great Migration as being from the South, primarily of African Americans after the end of slavery, and with the start of Jim Crow, a lot of people moving towards especially Rust Belt cities for industrial jobs between 1915 and 1917. We've also learned that in the Northeast, in places like Maine, the Great Migration sometimes is actually referring to the migration of Quebecois and French-speaking Canadians into this region, which, as I'll discuss later, also brought with it a lot of social conflict of Protestants, or sorry, of Catholics into an area that was chiefly with Protestants. And so here you can also see currently we have, this is from a project of the University of Washington. We can see how many Latin Americans are living in the United States by their country of origin. So like right now we have about 23 million people who are of Mexican, not even just ethnically, but like of citizenship. They were born in Mexico who currently live in the United States, right? So again, some of these you might say is due to climate change in those geographies. I've heard people present on how climate change is adding to the kinds of political crises, environmental, ecological crises that stemmed a lot from the US conquest or support of different regimes that enabled and supported the growing of vast fruit and other tobacco and sugar plantations in these areas that has now made it so difficult to sustain food crops and agriculture and livelihoods for people there. It has supported the creation of this gang violence and corruptocracy that is in these countries. And so that in that sense, a climate migration is deeply rooted not only to the environment, but also to political, historic, economic contexts. And so this is, you can see by geography, conversely, how many people from Latin America are living in various states. Very little of it actually has touched me. All right, so when we look at climate, right, so we know that from the foregoing, people have been moving around for many different reasons for a very long time. To what extent is climate now a big enough issue to really consider for this this question of climate migration? I always show this image because I think it's really stark, and it shows like from an ecological niche, they do a set of studies that say like form a kind of general human habitability, there is a kind of Goldilocks range that people really thrive in. Of course, there are people living in the Arctic and other places that don't seem to be deemed very high for suitability, but we see some of the world's largest populations living in places that are more suitable. And so they look at the projections for climate change. I believe it's the higher projections, which we are currently exceeding, right? Dave can say we're not even on track. We are exceeding those projections. So you'll see that in 2070, that zone of suitability has shifted north, right? So because it's following the places that are going to be too hot to live, and then that warm temperate zone is moving. And so the last one is a difference between places that are getting more suitable and places that are getting less suitable for climate. And so you can see that there is a huge set of areas that are becoming less suitable, including much of the southern part of the United States. And that the places that are getting more suitable include places like northern, like Maine, the Northeast, so the whole of the northern US and southern Canada. Of course, this means that from an equity perspective, the places that contributed the least to climate change are the places that are becoming less suitable for human habitation, and the converse is true as well. But at the same time, right, like when we see maps like this, we think of these books that say they are coming, and there's a whole kind of global discourse that dates back to our fears of the population bomb and the UN population efforts, and thinking about the demographic explosion and Malthusian economics and population growth. That is also very racialized. That's like, they are coming, and it's people from the global south. So we have to control population growth of people in other countries, when in reality, if we look at some of the environmental resource use, it's actually people in low population countries that have contributed a great deal, right? So when we think about that narrative versus the reality, where do people move after a disaster? It's not, I'm going to actually show this slide first. This is from Katrina, and this is showing, at least as of like a few months later, where people were applying for assistance from after they fled New Orleans. And you can see that most people stayed in the area of Louisiana, Mississippi, kind of a geography. And some people went, of course they went all over the place, but that most people stayed relatively close to home. The biggest places that they tended to go to are Houston, Dallas, like Baton Rouge, Atlanta, are the biggest places. And so that also tells you that people aren't thinking about fleeing to really far-flung corners. But if you look at the question of like buyouts, right? This is a study that was also recently published of people who took a buyout. That is to say, they were flooded, and they are repeatedly flooded, and the government has offered them money to take the money for their pre-disaster cost of the value of their home. They sell the property to the government buys it, they move wherever they are going to move, the government demolishes it usually and leaves it as is. Usually it's a lot, it's not restored. So we don't really know where people move after they take a buyout. And so this study was able to track a lot of people. They use like because FEMA doesn't track it, it's very hard. So they use very interesting methods to try to track people down. They managed to track down about 9,000 people worth of like people who have taken a buyout ever and where they go. And on average, they move about 8 miles from where they previously lived. So on this map, they're just showing it for Superstorm Sandy to give you a sense of where people moved after that event. And you can see in New Jersey for Middlesex, they are generally most people not moving that much farther than 10, 20 miles from where they were before. So all of that suggests that our assumptions that people are going to be fleeing large distances may or may not prove so true. They may move, but their first thought might not be to move all the way up to places like the Northeast. Here's another set here, right, of the population change on the left for the US from 2010 to 2018. In red are counties that lost population. In blue are counties that gained population. So you'll be able to see that a lot of the West and the South gained population, and a lot of the middle of the country, the Northeast, Rust Belt, most of Maine, has lost population. If you look at the image on the right, which is an index created by the EPA of like hundreds of indicators that they pulled together to say, what are the places that are the most resilient? In dark blue are the places that are most resilient. In the lightest colors are the places that are the least resilient. And on this map, you can see that the places like northern Maine are the most resilient places. And much of the upper Midwest is also, and the places that are in the West, the South, are the least resilient. And that's been the case, like just currently, right? And so we already know that if you just think without even thinking about climate change, yeah, like Arizona is really hot. Texas is really hot, and Florida is god awful humid, and the West has, they have earthquakes, they have drought, they have fires, they got all sorts of things going on, and yet people continue to move to those places because, as I said, they're moving for jobs, chiefly, and they are moving for family. And so there is a kind of a attraction effect, right? Like the more people that are there, the more family people they can attract that are there. And so the smaller you get, the fewer people you have to attract towards you, to go. So this all also suggests, like, just kind of, I'm not saying that people are not going to be moving. If anything, as a climate scientist, I would say that people should want to move to the upper northwest or northeast, the northwest and Midwest. But the reality is that most people currently do not think that way. All right, and so here we start to see that people are trying to project, well, just how many people might move because of things like sea level rise. So here, Matt Hauer and colleagues did a study where they said, okay, for sea level rise, which is, permanent inundation. It's not like we can air condition this thing off or we can elevate and we can move around. Like you are permanently going to be under some amount of water. How many people might be expected to leave some of our coastal communities? And based on their projections, they're estimating that, in red are places that are going to lose the most population. I think this is by 2100, right? So like cumulative by 2100. Those counties will lose a 250,000 population in red. And those in darkest blue-green are going to gain about 500,000 people. So you can see in Maine, again, like it's yellowish, which is 0 to negative 10,000. So a very small effect, and maybe the northern Maine might gain. So like on the whole, not so much total change. And this kind of data does not really, before I just say go to that side, there isn't this kind of projection for other kinds of hazards. So if you wanted to know like how many people are going to leave Arizona because it's going to get too hot by 2100, we don't have any guesses as to how many people that might be, or how many people are going to leave California because of all those fires. We could tell you how many people have left, but then we don't really know how many people are going to leave in the longer run. There's also plenty of data that says, people leave for a time and then they come back, right? So either it's because, you left this area. I had another professor from UMass Boston, Balakrishnan Balachandran, present. He did his work in New Orleans. He said, here's this guy, his family, they got flooded out 3 times. And his wife finally was like, oh, we cannot do this anymore. So they moved out of state, they moved somewhere else, they got divorced. And the guy eventually came right back and said, nowhere else feels like home, and I'm going to live here. Other people who like, they may move away, and then for a while, people are like, wow, that place is bad. That place really floods. Don't live there. And some time passes, and then people are like, look at that vacant land. It's just right for development, and we really need some space to put something. Let's build on it again. So Elise Var from Northern Texas University has shown that most people don't commemorate places that have flooded, even when there's major relocations. And without that kind of storytelling and commemoration, we forget in our own imaginations what that place is about. So we end up coming back and rebuilding there, right? So it's a bit hard to project, for flooding or for other things like how long, how permanently people are going to be moving from place to place. And so here again, he's showing like who moves. This is a different study, and they were showing that, usually it's like, yeah, you go to college, a huge number of people start moving when they're young. They find their first jobs somewhere in their 30s, they get married, they settle down, and they stop moving for quite some time. And maybe when you're in your final retirement year, maybe there's some more moving around. But by and large, it's a younger demographic that is much more mobile in this country, which means that when you get people who are moving, it's not just like total population change as if it's interchangeable. It has different effects. And so what he's showing here is that in the base population, you can see is the black line. In the blue line is the number of people who might move because of sea level rise. And in the red is the amplification because they moved. If you're young and you move, you are not only moving yourself, but you are moving the kids that you end up having somewhere else. And you're also not having your kids in the previous place that you came from. And because, as I said, there are these agglomeration economies that you are moving, the place that you move to, if it doubles in population, let's say, you're going to be able to have all these multiplier effects and attraction, more and more people are coming, and that's going to be conversely the case for the place that you are leaving. And so what this graph is showing, the big transparent wings that you see is just basically, well, there's a lot of margin of error. We don't really know. That could be the probability. But if you just look at these lines, is that the red line of the amplification effect is far greater than the number of people who move directly on their own as the effect. So that also adds a lot of uncertainty as to how many people we think are going to be moving. So most people then, what we are seeing is that, yeah, there are a lot of people who are moving. There's a lot of internal displacement in the United States. There's kind of like a bimodal set of people who are moving. Like on the one hand, we have lower income groups who are especially likely to be displaced because they don't have the funding to recover from a disaster, to rebuild. And on the other hand, we actually have a lot of wealthier people who are like, screw this, I'm moving to, Wyoming or to Maine. I can move, I could be anywhere because I'm a telecommuter and all those things. 5 to 7 years after a flood, many places will recover as people forget about the disaster. And the fiscal impacts sometimes do even out because there's a lot of disaster aid that comes from federal entitlements and other kinds of supports, but obviously, the kinds of concerns of people moving generates concerns for local economic development. And then we don't really know where people go to. We know more about places that people leave, but we don't track where they move to, and we don't know what happens to those communities so much. And so that is also compounded by some of the COVID and other kinds of migration issues. And so there's a lot that we can learn from people who have been studying migration, immigration, economic development of all kinds, and a bringing together of these communities. Like, this is not just a climate piece. It shouldn't just be people who are in the environment who care about this. We should be talking to people whose bread and butter is working with people who relocate and immigrate, whether for migration or for economic development. And I'll just say that most of the research has also been about individuals, like grandma, where's she going? Or this hippie, yuppie family from San Francisco who's going to buy a sheep farm in Vermont. Like, that's a scale at which we study these kinds of moves. But actually, maybe the more impactful move is, as I said, like the employers, right? So in upstate New York, we have the biggest silicon chip manufacturer that is going to be built in the country, just got sited outside of Syracuse, New York. It's $100 billion, and it's expected to bring possibly 50,000 jobs into the region. Like, 50,000 jobs for Syracuse is a very big deal. And if you think of all the multiplier effects of like who's building their houses and who's going to teach their kids and all of those kinds of things, it's a much bigger impact. And why did they choose this site, this piece of land? It has a lot of water, a lot of resources, and that the government has invested in trunk infrastructure for many decades, trying to attract for a long time some major industry to come here. And it's taken them like 30 years to finally get somebody like Micron to settle in this geography. Right. So another thing is, it's not like they're coming. We have to work to attract people, and that effort to build the infrastructure to get people to move someplace takes a very, very long time. So let me pause there and see if there's any questions that people want to just raise.
There are two in the chat, Linda. The first one was, in the US alone, there are over 333 million people. With continued drought and flooding and wildfires in our own country, there will be many parts of our country considered unlivable. It is my concern that land now used as farmland and forest will be overdeveloped in the Northeast, and that flora and fauna will be displaced in the Northeast. Your thoughts?
Yeah, great question, right? So this, to me, is number one on there about new jar, old wine. Like, it sounds a lot like what you're talking about is, how do we promote smart growth? We have always had this challenge of people are in need of housing and development. It doesn't matter necessarily whether they're moving for a climate reason or for a job reason. If they get someplace, the question is, where are we going to put people in that geography, right? And so I think there is a lot to be said about like how can we adapt people in situ, because those places are already impacted, compacted, and has the infrastructure to sustain that population and has that housing. Like to create so much new housing is far more expensive than existing housing. So we want to preserve that to the maximum extent possible. But you're right. As we talk about longer periods, if we continue at this rate, the projections are very serious that we're going to have massive dislocation. And that will mean major new kinds of construction for new cities. And so I think that before we start thinking about like how can we expand or is it going to expand and create new suburban development is a question of how do we create compact redevelopment of the places that we have already built. So there's so much of suburbs that we've already created in much of the Northeast, lots of parking lots, lots of dilapidated malls. There's many new efforts that are talking about how do we redevelop those kinds of sites to accommodate much more dense, mixed use, walkable kinds of living conditions. So I think that to your question, then I would say, yeah, we don't want that condition. And so the question is not necessarily just a climate migration question, but one of how do we promote smart, compact, dense development.
Thanks, Linda. I see Julia's hand. There's just one more question in the chat from Annie. Why is mid and northern Maine likely to receive more than the coastline? I think this came up when you were showing one of your maps. So Annie, you were referring to people, more people.
Yeah, and maybe it's because you're talking specifically about moving because of sea level rise.
Is this the
And
map
that's why
that you're looking at?
yes.
I couldn't tell you why they have the northern coastline equal to Portland. One would think that that is not the case. I will say that the scale here is negative 10,000 to 0. So it would light up the same color whether they lost 2 people or 9,999 people. And so given the size of the populations in these places, it may be that they just there's not enough people there to have so much variation in the numbers that you see here, would be my first guess. Julia?
Yeah, thanks so much, Linda. This is a great presentation, and it's interesting to sort of hear the new nuances and new sort of perspectives you're bringing to it. One of them is, or one of the things that struck me that you said today was how often people return after so many years to vulnerable places. And it made me realize that I carry an assumption that once, managed retreat or some sort of relocation has occurred, that land is automatically or frequently rewilded. But it sounds like that's not an appropriate, and that's not an accurate assumption. Do we have data that tells us the difference between what happens in places where there's been deliberate rewilding versus places that have been, from which people have left or that have been abandoned?
Yeah.
Without an
It's a good
intentional
question.
rewilding.
Yeah. First of all, I would say that most of the land that is, I will say at least bought out, I don't know about just straight out abandonment, but for the places that people have studied for the lands that have been bought out, very, very few of that percentages of that land gets rewilded or restored. Most often, if you go back to some place where somebody has picked up and moved and the house has been demolished, you will see that it looks exactly like the lot as it was, minus the house. If they had a lawn, it's a lawn. If they had a tree, there's still a tree. often because the remaining neighbors want that area to be mowed. So they want it to look at the bare minimum level of like emptiness. So it doesn't give that land the ability to rewild itself. Sometimes the thing that would take over might be Phragmites in coastal geographies or riparian areas. It's not like you can just automatically get like a beautiful wetland on top of that place. So there's not usually funding attached to buyout efforts to create a rewilded area. So you'd have to really get some monies for a land trust or somebody else to come to do the work of regenerating that site. So I don't know that, and it depends on which program you're using for buyouts. If you're using FEMA's buyouts, it cannot be rebuilt. If you're using HUD buyouts, it can be rebuilt. So there are different policies in different places, and that can make an impact as well. So all of those things, and even if people return, they might return to that town or the area. They might not return to that site specifically. That's what I meant. Let me move very quickly. I've been talking a lot about the Northeast anyway, so I think this section I can just kind of speed through. When we did the research on the Northeast, you can see that there are very specific areas where we have seen along bigger cities, some population growth, and many places that have seen lots of population loss. And that also means that these places are not really, they don't have the resources, the human capacity, much less the infrastructure capacity to like be thinking about and planning for how do we get lots more housing or development for potential people who might come or be wanting to come. We also saw that this is a region that has seen a lot of demographic fluctuations from the loss of the genocide of indigenous peoples and forced relocations to immigrations of a variety of different kinds of people to deindustrialization and then there's refugees and COVID-19. This is a place that has seen lots of comings and goings. And so again, it's not that this region cannot handle more people because more people often did used to live here. It's that I think the concern is how can we manage to have people moving in here in ways that don't just take over the places that now have been rewilded and forested? And how can we do it in a way that does not recapitulate the kinds of marginalization, exclusion, political conflict, social conflict? Like when the French Catholic Quebecois came, the largest KKK group in the country was actually against the French Quebecois who burnt down a church with the KKK movement, right? There's a lot of social conflict that comes with people moving in and out. But that doesn't tend to be something we often talk about. We'll see from this region, excluding New York and Boston areas, that we can see there is still not that much population gained. We are still seeing quite a lot of population loss. And that what gain there is, a lot of it is driven by international migration as opposed to natural increase from births and deaths. And this slide also is showing that the kinds of people who are moving, we are seeing a significant loss in white population and a concomitant replacement with people who are of two or more races, again, driven by often either more diverse domestic migration, but a lot by the international refugees who are moving in this region. And so one of the concerns is, yeah, like when people move, they are competing for housing. That was something that we heard a lot from people, like for instance, somebody talked about Stonington, Maine, which you guys probably know far, far better than me, that when there were lots of Airbnbs, it went from 3 in 2012 to almost 300 by 6 years later. And that meant that they were competing for housing from people who were fishermen who now have to live much farther because they couldn't get a house there, right? And so what is the response? The response is like, how do we build more workforce housing? How do we prevent foreclosures of housing? Or today, there is a vote in Ithaca about how do should we limit Airbnb to only owner-occupied units? You can't just buy a unit, rent it out forever. You can rent it if you're not there for a short amount of time only. So there are various responses to that. In Lewiston, there was a lot of refugee immigration. It went from the poorest census tract in Maine to 7 years later being designated the All-American City. And its vacant housing went from 20% to now 8%. And a lot of that occupied and rehabilitated by people from Somalia and other kinds of places. And there has been a lot of positive two-way cultural learning, like Bean trying to get its employees to understand Somali culture for various things, right? And today is Eid, actually. So Eid al-Fitr is the biggest holiday in the Muslim world, celebrating this time, the end of Ramadan. All right, and in Buffalo or Rochester, we saw a lot of migration, certainly from Puerto Rico after Maria. That was tied for the several decades of continuous migration, right? Again, people are following families. Like, why would I move to Rochester? Totally random in the middle of nowhere. It's because other people are there, and therefore I know I can find the food that I like, the kinds of churches or religious institutions, the social supports, the people who speak my language know my place, right? So again and again, what we learned in this project is that people are really concerned about housing. Am I in the wrong slides? No, yeah, so actually I'll just say here. So people are really concerned about housing was the message that we heard the most from folks. And that as they think about that, they wanted to think about how to address relocation as a driver of inequity, and to think about how do we think about migration as a way to promote greater equity compared to what we had before, and to combat that as a central point rather than a question of just infrastructure or movement of people. And that there is this kind of inequality of ecology as well of environmental change and risk, that we don't want to have more climate risk and environmental risk for the most marginalized people who are here or who might be moving here. That has to be also addressed as part of the project. So moving forward, this initiative has led to two different proposals, both to NOAA. One that I'll talk about of continuing the CAP program, and one that was a proposal to NOAA's Coastal Resilience Regional Collaborative funding opportunity that the Gulf of Maine Research Institute led up. So I'm going to just invite Dave to briefly introduce his project, or the project that he's leading.
Sure. Thanks, Linda. And so really what we've tried to do, for those that remember the NOAA CRRC solicitation, there were two tracks. Track one was to establish regional collaboratives, and track two were much larger infrastructure related grants. So states tend to focus on the track two, and nonprofits like ourselves tend to focus on track one. And so we pulled together a lot of the folks for a core team that really consisted of many of the folks that were involved in the NEST project that Linda has been talking about, to really establish a regional collaborative, a cross-jurisdictional regional collaborative that extends from Connecticut through Maine, to look at building capacity and creating a forum for tribal governance leaders, state government leaders, regional planning organizations, municipalities, to have a space to kind of share both what they're learning, what they're experiencing, and also build capacity and kind of expertise in how to kind of engage in this really loaded conversation around coastal displacement, relocation, and reuse of the coastal zone. And so we have, there are some examples, certainly from around the rest of the country, and some kind of emergent in this kind of upper Northeast region. And so we'll be drawing on kind of case studies throughout. But really what's highlighted here is kind of the three kind of big phases of the project. And you can see kind of the main deliverables that will come out of it. Again, the overarching objective here is to establish and build this regional collaborative to really, again, build the capacity to start talking about this pretty challenging and gnarly issue that inevitably, scores of places along the coast are going to be grappling with over the coming decades. The second big phase is to create the evidence base to support coastal transformation. and that will include largely a synthesis of quantified flood risk information, particularly for regions that are most at risk, assessing housing, land use, and fiscal policy barriers to transformative adaptation. And then finally, highlighting a few archetypal case studies. You know, there are very distinct types of communities along this stretch of coastline, and we want to make sure that we're able to kind of bring forward the different traits and characteristics so everybody can kind of have a great chance of seeing themselves, in a sense, in the communities that we'll be focusing on. And then finally, you know, we really want to build that enduring capacity to implement this transformative coastal adaptation that we're going to be talking about. And part of that will be thinking about governance and policy reform strategies. Part of it will be, you know, creating that kind of facilitated community of practice to sort of enable kind of two-way exchange of information, both among the policymakers themselves, but also kind of the broader regional collaborative of experts. And then finally, I think one of the really important things to think about here is, you know, just sort of the opportunities that can be presented in thinking about a re-envisioned coastal zone. You know, I have a map hanging in my office of the city of Portland from 1776, and basically it's what was then Falmouth. And we have, you know, brought in a ton of fill and massively altered the coastline. And we did this 250 years ago with far less technology. And so I guess my point in talking about that is really that we have precedent for entirely manipulating our coastlines and changing the way we interact with them. And we're going to need to do the same thing moving forward. And it's really just trying to start that conversation, explore ways of doing that, understand, you know, the values, the trade-offs, the different options, the financing, all that kind of stuff. And that's really what we're trying to tee up with this regional collaborative. It was submitted in February. We should hear later this spring, and it would get underway towards the end of this calendar year and last for about 4 years. Thanks, Linda.
Thanks so much, Dave. Awesome job. And so complementing that is another project here for what we are saying for Nest, which is, don't look at the slide. I'm sorry, this is maybe, yeah, I won't even talk through the slide, but the main points here is that we see a real divide. Like, we want to focus on this question of housing. The fundamental limitation here is housing. It's already a constraint, it's already a crisis, and it'll only get worse whether people leave and abandon housing or lots more people come in and want to take on housing. So when we look at the issue of housing, we recognize that there are big divides between people who focus on affordable housing construction and advocacy, and the people who work on making things decarbonized and energy efficient, and the people who work on flood resiliency and climate adaptation. And so we want to see opportunities for creating a space, for creating data and creating the people, the leadership abilities to say, what would it take for us to create a lot of affordable housing that is decarbonized and energy efficient in places that are free from flood risks or in more higher ground and that are more resilient. So we saw that, like, in a lot of state policies for their adaptation planning, they don't really even talk about a lot of the housing components because it's not recognized as an issue. And there are many ways in which there are potential for conflicts, for maladaptation, as well as things where they share a need for addressing some fundamental issues that make it hard to do any of the work, whether it's about resiliency, affordability, or decarbonization. So what we've proposed is a very complex system here, but it has a logic to its madness of basically having a set of data analyses on the flood side, a kind of analysis of zoning and land use, and a set of analyses around energy efficiency and human capacity. So there's a lot of research that's compounded that this would produce. And then there would be a set of partnerships with different groups, bringing together in the last row here leaders of different networks of housing, of energy, and of resiliency that already exist, and putting them in conversation with each other to teach each other about their realms, and then identify places where they could advocate for shared policy change or shared pilot initiatives that would do the kind of work that we are thinking of. It's the same time frame as Dave here for being awarded, and it would last for the next 5 years with a potential for renewal. So just to conclude us here, I would say that climate migration is actually really uncertain, and we don't know a lot about who is going to come, when they're coming, how many are going to come, but that we know that it is going to be really different from what has happened before. We know that these communities are able to have agency in how much we can attract or resist migration and how to prepare for it. And that the key thing we have to be thinking about is how to address inequities, in particular in the issues of housing access, as well as social difference, which tends to be not something we talk about when we talk about sectors of jobs and housing and land use, but they are the most important ones when we are talking about migration and people moving into these places. And there's an opportunity to learn. There's a lot of great practices that different states and cities are doing in the region. And that's why we're putting forward these projects to create opportunities for people to be in conversation with each other.